I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's have a look at Canon's latest RF 70-200mm f2.8 LIS USM Z. And Z stands for zoom, specifically the fact that you can buy an extra cost option for power zoom, which talks to these electronic contacts and has a gear that runs through and talks to this ring like this. Also, what's different about it is it does have some gear teeth on the aperture ring here. But first off, let's start off with some sample images. All these sample images are shot as large JPEGs, but in the lowest possible quality JPEG compression setting, quality 1, which gives me the smallest file size, which still looks awesome, as you're going to see here. This is an AI-controlled Porsche 917, a classic car. It's rounding turn 10 at Watkins Glen. This was shot with my EOS R5 Mark II at 178mm at f5 at 1/250th. At auto ISO 100. Here's some exploding waves at sunset in Solana Beach, California. This is on the EOS R5 Mark II at 200mm at f8 at 1/1000th at auto ISO 100. Here's a lifeguard station in Pacific Beach, California. This is at 200mm at f5.6 at 1/800th of a second at auto ISO 100. Of course, the lens is sharp, as you've seen. Here's a Ferrari Monza SP2 6.5-liter V12 engine. This is at 126mm at f4.5 at 1/320th of a second at auto ISO 100. And you'll notice as I zoom in here how sharp it is on this crinkle coat paint. And also the Bokeh is really nice. We'll cover that in more detail, but it's super smooth. Optically, this lens is flawless. All of Canon's f2.8L telephoto zooms have been ultra sharp pretty much since the beginning. Here's the Pacific Beach Pier. This is at 159mm at f5.6 at a 6/40th of a second at auto ISO 100 on my 45-megapixel R5 Mark II. And as I'm zooming in here, you'll notice the pier isn't even in focus. The autofocus system of the R5 Mark II is so good that it found the surfing guy, focused on his face, and you'll see it's focused very tightly on him as I zoom in here. And you'll see, of course, it's ultra sharp. Today, it's a sad thing. It's the non-professional photographers who worry the most about lens sharpness. Honestly, every lens is super sharp if you use it correctly. The unsharpness most people get are caused by silly things like shooting at the wrong ISO. I'm shooting this action at ISO 100, the camera's sharpest ISO. And also people will stop down too far because they worry about not being able to get the right focus, etc., etc. But that's not the subject of this. The main thing is I just got you guys to watch a slideshow while I chit-chat about the performance of this lens. So how cool is that? The main reason I love this lens compared to the older non-Z RF lens that came out 5 years ago back in 2019 is that it's a dream to zoom this lens. The other lens is a pumper zoom. So in other words, as you change the zoom settings on the older lens, the whole lens comes in and out. With this lens, with just one gentle fingertip, I can make this lens zoom. I don't have to push it hard. I can just gently glide my finger over here. And when you shoot all day long, being able to do this, let's see, for instance, you've got the lens held like that. Zoom in, zoom out, it works wonderfully. I don't have to use two fingers and crank it in and crank it out. It's easy to use either pointed straight up or straight down. It's very well balanced, and therefore zooming is always a dream. That's the main reason I love this lens so much like the RF 24-105 f2.8L IS USM that I thought was going to be a poser heavy lens. No, they're both wonderful because when you actually shoot all day long, it's a dream to have the zoom work so magnificently smoothly. That's what I really love about this lens. The weight is about the same as the other lens. Honestly, depending on which lens has the tripod foot or tripod collar attached, it's going to make the biggest difference in weight between the non-Z marked lens. This lens comes in two colors. You can get it in this white or you can get it in black. It's one of the very few lenses today that Canon makes available in two colors. How about that? Honestly, if you're going to be outdoors all day, that's the supposed technical advantage of the white to keep the lens cool. If you're shooting indoors, you may as well get black so nobody bugs you, or that's a personal preference. This lens works brilliantly with either the RF 2 times or RF 1.4 times teleconverters, but it only works with one converter at a time. That's another huge advantage of this lens over the older non-Z RF 7200 f2.8L IS-USM because that lens doesn't work with any teleconverters. So while Canon pitches this as a video lens because of this remotely controllable zoom function, I actually prefer it for still photography. I don't shoot video with this. In fact, every video you see here on this channel is recorded with my iPhone. Why? Because it gives me better real-world results. Some lenses from Canon are like this, and you can check my online reviews at kenrockwell.com, and the links are always in my description. This lens has essentially instantaneous autofocus. When I'm shooting, it pops faster than my own eyes can focus. From near to far, it just goes. And it does it silently as well. That's a beautiful thing. It also has negligible focus breathing. In other words, as you focus manually or automatically between subjects, the size of the image doesn't vary enough for anyone ever to notice. The only way you'll see that is if you deliberately stop down to f22, then focus near and far and look at the image, and it changes just a little bit. But you're not going to see it if you're actually shooting any sort of drama. It's also got an additional programmable control ring, and this one's got steps. So this is very useful for setting exposure compensation or ISO or whatever you like. It comes with a nice padded case at no additional charge. Not that I need this case because this lens fits in all my other bags, but it comes with a case. I wish my 200 to 800 Canon lens came with a case because that lens is so long that I do have to store it separately. It also comes with this nifty white hood. There's no rubber bumpers on either of these lenses. This is just hard black plastic. Unfortunately, this is a hard black plastic filter thread. It's not metal as the good lenses used to be, and that to me is a sticking point because I tend to use filters. And with the metal thread, it just slides right on. With a plastic thread, you can cross-thread it, and you have to pay more attention to it, so, boo-hoo. This also has a little trap door here. The little trap door lets you adjust your polarizers and rotating grads when the hood is on. It also has a locking pawl, so when you mount this little rascal, it's not going to come off because it's going to lock on. And to remove it, remember to disengage the locking pawl. Also, when you get yours, be sure you get a USA lens, assuming you're in the United States of America. It will come with this printed card. If you don't get this printed card, and the serial number has to match your lens. Look at that. I got serial number 2. How about that for an average shooter? I always order my stuff the day it comes out. And if you don't get this, you've got a gray market lens, which means if you're in the USA, you got something fishy. Unless you save like $500 on this lens by getting a gray market version, I wouldn't do it. And the way to ensure you get a USA product, don't ever buy it at retail. I only get my stuff from P&H and Adorama since the 1970s, and my dad was buying from Crutchfield since the early 1970s. And the reason I use those folks is because everything ships from a private, secure, lockdown warehouse. It's not from some retail store. Every customer's come in and, touched and twiddled with your lens and then dropped and returned and everything, and you can't tell if it's ever been out of the box. And also, the box is totally unsealed. It's just a cardboard box. It's not even like buying a bottle of milk that has a seal on it. So you really need to buy from the big retailers. I do. Otherwise, you never really know what you're going to get. And there's a full list of those guys in the description of this video. What's missing on this lens is that the tripod collar doesn't come off, or at least I haven't been smart enough to figure out how to get it to come off. You can remove the shoe by loosening this knob, pressing this release, and then sliding it off, but then you still have this clunky thing, and there's no threaded insert in here. You do have 3/8 inch and 1/4 inch on the foot itself. And this is clumsy. Since I'm always shooting handheld, this is always tending to get in my way. And it is the biggest advantage of the pumper zoom, the older RF non-Z 7200 2.8, is that the whole tripod collar assembly can come off of that lens. So if you're only going to shoot handheld, maybe that's a thought. But honestly, to me, the convenience of having this wonderful, just super glide zoom, as opposed to dealing with the pumper zoom, to me makes having this thing in the way all worthwhile. Also, what's weird is this aperture ring is mostly for video shooters. It's got an interlock here, which is not easy to use while you're actually shooting, because you need to push this forward and then you can release it. So it either controls the aperture or the A position, oddly, simply means it's controlled at the camera. Here, there's no click stops, which to me is downright bizarre, because I come from the old school where when something happens, we would immediately know what aperture we wanted, and as we're turning to catch the action when I shot in the news, you could just count clicks, boom, 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 F8, or F28 if they're in the shade or whatever. With this, it just glides, and that means you have to look at the indicator in your viewfinder to figure out what aperture you're going to get. And the problem is, at least as of 2025 on my R5 Mark II, is that the aperture does not update instantly in the viewfinder. So therefore, that delay means as you're adjusting this, because you're not seeing this when you're adjusting it through the finder, you have to sit there and look at the indicator and then twiddle with this, and because it doesn't really click, if you want F8, you're like, oops, okay, 6.3, oops, 7.1, oops, 9. It just takes too darn long. So I don't use this. I much prefer to use the camera's controls that have clicks, but at least it's there. Also, this is mostly for shooting in the video mode of any camera. Only the very newest, as of 2025, Canon cameras like the R5 Mark II actually can respond to this aperture ring while you're shooting still shots. That may change with future firmware upgrades, but honestly, I don't like the aperture ring. But you do have that option. You can just ignore it, which is what I do. Let's look at the lens's bokeh. The bokeh is excellent. Here it is at 70 millimeters at f2.8, and this is at headshot distance. And the reason I use my weather station as opposed to a gorgeous model is because this is constant. I'm not going to be able to get a gorgeous model out there and get the same model every single day as I do from my weather station, and therefore you can go into my other lens reviews and see the same dopey weather station. Actually, it's a really good American-made weather station, but see the same exact weather station in similar settings, although different day and different weather, to compare bokeh between lenses. This is at f2.8 at a 3200th at auto ISO 100. If you want soft backgrounds, you wouldn't be shooting at 70, you'd be shooting at 200 millimeters. And here it is at 200 millimeters at f2.8 at a 1600th at auto ISO 100. And as always, if you want the softest possible backgrounds, shoot at f2.8. More importantly, shoot at 200 millimeters and get as close as you can, because as you get closer, you have to focus closer, which, throws the background out of focus. As shot, there's no distortion with distortion correction on. If you're silly enough to turn distortion correction off and then go looking for distortion, there's no distortion at 70 millimeters. It becomes mild pin cushion at 100 millimeters, and then from 135 to 200 millimeters, it's relatively moderately strong pin cushion, which is not something you're really going to notice, but if you're sitting there deliberately shooting straight lines and looking for it, make sure you've got the distortion correction turned on. If you've got the peripheral illumination correction turned on, there's no visible fall off. Even if you go out of your way to turn off correction, it's still not that bad at f2.8 in actual photos. I'm exaggerating here by showing gray on gray. That's pretty good performance. I always shoot images, which are JPEGs. If you're shooting raw data, that's not even a picture yet. It doesn't become a picture until you process it in software. Every software is different, and every software may or may not correct for distortion or other lens aberrations in different ways. So I can't speak to that. If you're shooting raw, you don't really know what you've got out of the camera because you can't see it until you turn it into an image, which you have to do with software. And as I said, every piece of software is different. And you could spend a lifetime picking among different kinds of raw software programs. So I shoot JPEG because, well, it's a religious thing, but I can do everything I want, change exposures and white balances and all that is easy to do in JPEG. Most people don't realize you can pull your JPEGs into Adobe Camera Raw exactly like a RAW file and make exactly the same changes to it, believe it or not. Filters work great. Other than the fact that it's got this crappy plastic filter ring, which is pretty much par for the course today, you can stack lots and lots of filters even at the 70 millimeter end on full frame. But that's typical. As it's a long lens, we don't have problems often with vignetting from using filters that are too thick. What's really nice is there's little to no problem with flare or ghosts. Shooting straight into the sun for sunsets, at worst, there'll be a slight ghost opposite the setting sun, and that's easy to dig out in Photoshop. There's no lateral color fringes with the default digital lens optimizer left on. If you go out of your way to turn it off and then go looking for it, or depending on what RAW software you might use, there's very slight green magenta fringing at 70, none at the middle focal lengths, and very slight magenta green fringing at 200 millimeters. This is superb. For instance, 1989's excellent EF 8-200 f2.8L was much worse, and that was back in the days when we didn't even have correction available. Macro performance is superb. It gets super close, and it's also ultra sharp. Here it is f2.8, meaning there's absolutely nothing except about 3 atoms in focus because there's no depth of field with any lens this close at pretty much any aperture. This is shot at 200 millimeters at f2.8 at a 4,000th of a second at auto ISO 100, and you'll see what little is in focus, the 3 molecules that are ultra sharp. So bravo to this lens. It gets really close. And it focuses even closer at 70 millimeters than it does at 200 millimeters, so you can always get nice and close. Mechanically, it's typical for today for a nice lens. It has a metal mount, the internals are mostly metal, and except for the tripod collar, everything else is plastic on the outside. These knobs are actually plastic. The slide switches are plastic, as they've been since, well, for the past 40 years. The rings are all plastic. These buttons on the outside are plastic. This is hard plastic. This is rubber covered plastic, rubber covered plastic. I wish there was a metal filter thread up here. It wouldn't add any significant amount of weight, and for me, it would make it much more useful. But that's par for the course. The serial number is laser engraved on the bottom of the lens, which is probably more visible here than it will ever be visible out in the field because I've got a lot of light on this and I'm showing it really close. Good luck trying to read this in the field. Although with use, it might get filled with dirt. I don't know. This is a relatively new lens to me. When you shake it, there's only very minor rattling. Really, I have to work pretty hard to get it to rattle. Thank goodness it's actually made in Japan domestically where Canon is based. It's not offshore purely to save Canon money on manufacture. That's among the many reasons I prefer Canon today over Nikon or Fuji or Sony, who export their stuff to other countries simply to save themselves money, but they don't pass that on to me. It seems like Canon lenses, everything else costs about the same, so I'd rather stick with quality manufacture. I like my German cars to be made in Germany, my French wine to be made in France, my Italian cheese to be made in Italy, and that's me. I figure it's more authentic if it comes from the same country as it's designed. Spherochromatism, which is different than lateral color fringes. Spherochromatism is colored fringes on out-of-focus highlights. The in-focus stuff has no color fringes, and this has only minor green-magenta spherochromatism on things that are out of focus. And here's a black and white watch, and you can see that slightly. I don't think we would ever see any spherochromatism in actual use. And even when lenses have it, it goes away as you stop down. Image stabilization is superb. I get 4 real stops of real-world improvement shooting on my stabilized R5 Mark II, which means that at 70 millimeters, I only get tripod equivalent sharpness all the time at a 1/25th with stabilization off. With stabilization on, every single shot, I mean, sure there'll be some that aren't, but every single shot is tripod equivalent sharp at 1/8 of a second at 70 millimeters. At 200 millimeters, under exactly the same conditions, I can only get perfect tripod sharpness at a 500th of a second with stabilization off, but I turn stabilization on and ooh, baby, 30th of a second, every single shot for me is perfect, tripod equivalently sharp. I love that. And even if I shoot at a 15th at 200 millimeters, where almost half of them are also tripod equivalently sharp, what I do when I get stuck is a standard trick I've always used in continuous advanced mode. Just fire off a few frames and pick out the one that's actually sharp. Sunstars, not that great. There's really nothing going on with Sunstars at the largest apertures. At the very smallest apertures, I do get some marvelous 22-point Sunstars on brilliant points of light with an 11-bladed diaphragm, but it's only at the smallest apertures. Ignore the vertical smear at the large apertures. That's a sensor artifact called interline transfer smear. Likewise, at the smallest apertures, the rainbow dots you're seeing are caused by interaction between the various wells on the sensor of my camera. It's nothing to do with the lens. Now, I've already compared it to the original 5-year-older RF 70-200 f2.8L IS USM non-Z, and you can see an explicit knockdown drag-out table with every possible thing compared, like how long they are, close focus distances, etc., exact weights, at my written review at kenrockwell.com, and again, links are in the description. I also have a written user guide at my review talking about what the different modes are here, modes 1, 2, and 3, and I could go on forever, but I think you've heard enough about a lens. Thanks for watching kenrockwell.com here on kenrockwell.tv. Any questions or anything, feel free to email me. Links are all in the description to my site. Thanks again, kenrockwell.com, here on kenrockwell.tv. I'll see you in the next video.